podcasting. I'm John Moore, and in the chat with us we have Rich Bowden, one of my previous students. So today we'll start off with a little bit about myself, in case you don't know who I am. I've been podcasting for a few years, and this webinar is about what I wish I'd known back in 2015 when I was contemplating the whole process. So these are the things you need to know before you start podcasting, things to think about, things to basically have squared away before you start. So that'll make your life a lot easier when you actually do come to start podcasting. I have 4 podcasts I do on my own: World Organic News, Zen Druid Podcast, PodThoughts, and one called Mr. John Moore, where I experiment with sound. Also a co-host on The Real Food Chain with my co-host here today, Rich Bowden. So that's about me. Now, the things you need to ask you before you start podcasting are things like, why do I want a podcast? What's the purpose? Do I know what niche I'll be aiming at? Who are my listeners? Why would they want to listen? Do I have a passion, and what is my message? Are you prepared to do all the work that's necessary to get this stuff out? And the first few episodes can be more work than passion, but it's worth the effort. Given enough time, it just sort of suddenly clicks and you have a workflow and everything moves from one show to the next. If you're doing this to increase your sales, then it really needs to tie in with your website and your other marketing channels, but it's a good way to get ideas and promotions out to people. And even if you're just doing it for brand awareness, it also fits in well there. But the trick is to recognize why you're doing it. And what's the best reason for starting a podcast? Passion, really. Passion for your listeners. And if you can look after them, you're laughing. So the next question is, what's stopping you? Now, it took me 12 months of what's stopping me to get round to actually podcasting. And the first one, of course, was knowledge of the process, understanding where the files went, how they got to listeners, how to even record a file. But that's all part of the process. And the process itself is different from radio, different from television, different from YouTube. There's another layer in between with discovery places like iTunes and Stitcher and other aggregators. So you have to get your file recorded, edited, post-produced, and then published. You've got to get that through these libraries to your listeners. Understanding that process is really important. Defining your niche is important too. It's a strange thing. It's the tighter the niche, the more listeners you're likely to get engaged with. So if you're just doing a internet marketing podcast, that covers a lot of things. Now, if you're going to specialize and say, I'll do internet marketing through Facebook ads on Messenger, you're more likely to get more listeners with a really tightly defined demographic that way. Write down who you think your ideal listener is so that you can actually speak to them while you're recording. Although after that probably won't kick in until after about episode 7 or 8, because you're more worried about the tech in the first 6 or 7 episodes anyway. Finding your voice is a tricky thing too. Now that'll depend on which microphone you're using on a purely audible level, but finding your voice in the sense of a writer finding their voice also takes time. It depends on whether you're doing interview episodes or you're writing out a full script and doing an audio essay, or somewhere in between. But there's a knack to finding your own voice, and it only comes through practice. Now, having recorded, say, 20 episodes in the can as a practice won't have anywhere near the effect as publishing your first 5 episodes, because it's live. And going live puts a pressure on you that just recording for practice doesn't do. The tech can be confusing, and that can slow a lot of people up. I found a way that removes most of the tech, and I find life a lot easier. And we'll come to that a little bit later in the webinar. So the solution is to have the right mindset. Once you've got yourself in a space where you're happy to to hear your own voice, which can be a bit off-putting to start with. You've defined your message, and you know who it is, to whom it is you are speaking. The people will come. Word gets about. Word of mouth is the best discovery tool in podcasting. And picking the right category when you list with Facebook, with iTunes helps as well, because people search by passion and desire rather than by feedback from other listeners, unless they know them personally. So unless someone tells you to listen to a podcast, you're not likely to take a recommendation from someone with a strange name on the iTunes page. And most people have a listen to a podcast before they subscribe. So the trick is to have that voice nailed down, to know your passion and know to whom you're speaking, because that makes your life so much easier. You find that, Mr. B?
I do. Yeah. What's interesting about what you say about finding your voice, I remember you said it took quite a while for you to, and it just suddenly came. It wasn't something that you practiced. It just sort of suddenly happened.
Yeah, well, I was focusing on the tech and the process. There's a photo of Mr. B for anyone watching. Smile, Rich.
That's my smile.
That's enough. Well, we don't want to frighten the people off.
All right.
So, to understand the tech, which is what happens before your voice comes, because you need to know what's going on, we need to look back in history a little bit. We're in a fairly remarkable part of history with the IT revolution, and it's making life a lot easier. In the olden days, if you wanted to get your voice out, you had to go through a radio station. And to go through a radio station, you had to be surrounded by audio engineers, executive producers, gatekeepers left and right. And this was a result of the first industrial revolution, where basically everything became a hierarchy, not dissimilar to the Roman army in a lot of ways, with gatekeepers at the top and people at the bottom being told what to do. So instead of having craftsmen sitting in their little cottages spinning wool and making product themselves whenever they felt like they needed to get it done to get the job done, people were forced into factories and became widgets, basically, in service of the machine. With the IT revolution, we're removing that drudgery, the legwork. Computers are really good at doing repetitive things over and over again, which was what people had been forced into in factories. So this now refrees us to go back to our creativity again and allow us to live our passions, basically. So we use, algorithms get a bad name. Robots are going to take our jobs. We'll all be ruined. But in fact, if we use the algorithm's just a set of statements. If this, do that. If we pick the right ones and use them for the right purpose, our lives become a lot easier. So basically, I use software as much as possible, because with the algorithms, the software is continually self-improving. And a self-improving tool is one that makes life a lot easier. So instead of, like, I knew an old radio friend who used to go through waveforms and take out the same bump on every wave symbol for 4 or 5 hours at a time, and it had taken days to get it right, to get the sound he wanted. And that was for people that were going to be listening on high fidelity equipment, with surround sound and all the rest of it. But understanding that most podcast listeners listen with earbuds or through the radio in their car, and soon to be Alexa and Google Home and those sorts of things, the sound quality requirements are not the same. And the voice is not music. A lot of the stuff we have to make do with was designed for musical production. And musical production gets awfully complicated because you've got to balance all the different instruments. Think of just a standard 4-piece rock group. You've got the drums, the bass, the lead, and the voice. By the time you add in, you get to the level of a symphony orchestra, it's mind-bogglingly complicated. The good thing about podcasting is it's the voice. 1, 2, 3, 4 people usually at the most. Occasionally you'll do an open mic and you'll have people with questions in a larger room. But that's the exception rather than the rule. So if we've picked equipment that's designed for outdoor work means we don't have to have a soundproof studio to work in. As you can see from behind me here, I'm working in the lounge room, and I've got the curtains there on my left-hand side, possibly your right, and blank walls behind us. But I'm using the Zoom, which was designed for journalists to use outdoors, so it's far more forgiving on background noise. And it's also an excellent piece of kit that I highly recommend. If we flick over to Mr. B, Young Rich, you can see the room he's in. Nice hard surfaces at the back there. Very classy headphones, which may or may not help. The thing with recording and editing is I like to use the earbuds because that's what most of my listeners use. As you can see, I've just got one here in the side because I only listen with one ear. That way I can hear what's going on around me. So we get the tech that's as simple as possible and as forgiving as possible. And then I use software that's equally as forgiving. So when we get to the editing process, I cut as much of that down as possible. So basically with editing, I just take out the bits I don't want, possibly move some intro and outro into the beginnings and ends of each file. And there's one of the podcasts I do, I put a bell in the middle just towards the start, so that it's a really quick, simple process and takes not much longer than the time it took to record the file. Then I use an algorithm-based process to tidy it up, level out the voices, and get it to the standards required for publication. All these things are doable. All these things are basically free, apart from the cost of your mic and your laptop. And podcasting is a free medium. Making money from it's a tricky thing. You're far better off to focus on your passion and growing a community. From the community, then you might get yourself some money, but don't go into it for the money. You won't last. It's about the passion. If you don't have the passion for what you're doing, it won't last. And you compare it to other hobbies. Think of it as a hobby to start with. Now, the cost of fly fishing, rods, reels, and then flies is horrendously expensive. Now, I picked this up for $180 secondhand. It's got a 32 gig, SD card in it, so I can record up to 4 days worth of material if I really needed to. So if I'm on the road, I can just keep adding files and then drop it down into my laptop to process it. And compared to the cost of other hobbies, that we've just had the Winter Olympics on, a good snowboard is going to cost you a couple of $1,000. So this is great. It's cheaper. It allows you to get your voice out and you can talk to the world. I've had feedback from people in Mongolia, Uganda, all over the world. It's as well as the usual English-speaking countries. But the lady in Mongolia sent me a photo. She's on her summer trip. So she had a yurt out on the steppe with a fairly sizable satellite dish on the top of it, which she uses to listen to podcasts and connect with the world. So we can reach anyone, basically. And the trick with that, though, is that not everyone is on ADSL or fibre to the house. The trick is to remember your listeners. And a lot of listeners here in Australia, even west of the ranges, are still on dial-up, even though we're apparently getting this wonderful new national broadband network, but we're not holding our breath for it. So if we craft our files in a way that people on the lowest possible standard of internet can download us, one, they get to hear us. Two, people on the really high-powered stuff, it downloads in no time at all. So everyone wins. And we're not a radio station. This is what really confuses people to start with when they just, because radio is the thing we all know about in the audio medium. But by doing it this way, through podcasting, we can set the standards so that people can still hear us and the files are small and we can get out to lots of people. So I always publish in 64 kilobits per second in mono. And people will tell you that the quality is too low, but by the time it goes through the system and it's an MP3, by the time people hear it, It's not symphony orchestra recording standard, but it's the voice, and people can hear the voice, and that's enough for people. So long as you're clearly legible or clearly audible, and you include good show notes, people will get what they need from what you've got to say. And it's a funny thing, podcasting. It adds a routine to your life because you have to publish at the same time every week. If you're doing a weekly, or the same 2 days if you're doing bi-monthly, or at the same time if you're doing one every day. And having been involved in all those forms, it's the consistency that matters. People love it. You find this yourself, Mr. B?
That's something I've had to get used to, John, but taking your advice, there's been times that the timetable has been very tight. I'm now looking at putting aside a day a week completely for podcasting. I'm hoping to do that. But totally what you said, yeah, it becomes a timetable, a part of your life. You're always thinking about, well, okay, if you've got a podcast that needs to go out the next day, the editing that needs to be done, but also the interview that you need to do. I do interviews in our podcast, and when to get that ready, when to organise that for the next one. So it becomes an enjoyable part of life. You know, you're thinking ahead all the time, and it's not just something that, this maybe we might go out this week or maybe next week if we're right. It's definitely you've got a date to get that out. It's really important for listeners.
Yeah, it's routine is a good thing anyway. The host I use, Libsyn, put out a series of podcasts a couple of years ago entitled "What Podcasting's Done for Me," and there was quite a few people. Probably 30% of the episodes were for people with who were suffering mental health issues. And podcasting had saved them because it gave them a routine. And those were the words they used, not me. Because they had to turn up on time and do what they had to do. It was,
And connection too. Connection as well. I think it's important in that situation. Connecting with other people who understand that, I think. That's quite fascinating though. I'll have to look at that.
Yeah, it's in iTunes. What podcasting did
the
for
feed?
me. Yeah, no, not the feed. This is a separate one called
okay.
What Podcasting Did for Me.
Okay.
But yeah, so I'd recommend it for anyone who, even if they're not going to podcast, because it's quite uplifting. But by the time you finish it, you'll be wanting to podcast. I think there's about 12 episodes. And the danger, of course, is that there's an infinite number of podcast shows. And I get 3 or 4 different ideas a week thinking, that'll make a good show. I don't have time. There's plenty of space out there, and there's plenty of room for people. There's a lot less podcasters than there are YouTube types, and a lot less podcasts than there are blogs. So the space, while it appears to be busy, is actually, there's plenty of room, and the more the merrier. And because you can specialise in your own niche, you're not likely to be stepping on anyone else's toes or have anyone else come over the top of you. And once you've developed your own voice, well, then, of course, that's why yours is different. There's quite a few podcasts on podcasting that I've listened to, and there's probably only 3 that I listen to now because I just couldn't connect with the podcaster. And it's that connection, the voice speaking straight into your head. And because it's voice, you're allowed to imagine whatever people look like. And then when finally I see people on their website, they don't look anything like I imagined them on the podcast, which can be a little disappointing at times, but it's just the magic of the thing. And you can do so much more with audio. There was a British comedy program in the 50s called The Goon Show, which was just frighteningly funny, written by Spike Milligan. So it was all over the place intellectually, and you just go to extremes. I remember in the 70s they tried to make it into a TV show with puppets like Thunderbirds, and it just didn't work because your imagination was curtailed by what was on the screen. So remember, you have a powerful medium here in podcasting. Your voice can change any number of things. get through to people in ways that you don't understand yourself until you get the feedback. And people will feedback. They'll let you know what's going on. There was a stage there for the first time in my life a couple of years ago. I had laryngitis and couldn't speak. And 2 days after the first missed episode, I got a flood of emails saying, "Are you okay? What's going on?" So I was able to type back that I had lost my voice, and I put up a couple of emergency shows I'd had recorded just in case something happened. But people connect, even if you don't hear it every week. They're listening. And most people don't feel the need to contact you, but some do. And it's touching when they do. You know, I still fondly remember that lady from Mongolia. That was, of all the places. Yeah. 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 It's a medium I would recommend. So if you're thinking about podcasting yourselves, all my wonderful listeners out there, I run a course called Podcasting for Beginners, which is also subtitled Podcast Like a Pro, which will run you through all the stuff that took me 12 months to learn and all the things I've learned since podcasting. So there's tips and tricks, and the basics are covered, and it'll get you started and you'll be up and running. You can do the whole thing in a day if you put your mind to it, or you can pace yourself out over a week. The website for that is mrjonmoore.com. That's mrjohnmoore.com. And we'd really love to see you there, and I'd like to help. Mr. B here, Young Rich, was my first student in an ad hoc way. I got an email saying I was going to start a podcast, but we had, what was the word, Rich? Artistic differences with the potential host you were going to work with. So we worked together, and I came up with some lists and checklists and things.
What was that, John?
Eh?
What was that?
Before we started the Real Food Chain.
Oh, okay.
I sent you a whole set of checklists, and I thought, this would make a good course. And I said, "Have you started?" And you said, "Oh, we had artistic differences." I said, "Do you want me to start with you?" "Yeah, all right." And away we went.
So, that was it, yes. And never look back. Never look back.
Yeah,
No,
it's probably best not to. Yeah.
I can highly recommend the course, and I can highly recommend John. He's always been very patient with his time and generous, including times when I haven't been able to load certain episodes up on Libsyn. I send a message late at night to John, and he's always been very helpful indeed. So I highly recommend that you have a look and try the course. I think it's very beneficial.
Thank you. Oh yeah, I appreciate that. I wasn't expecting it, but yeah, no, it's fun. It's it's problem solving. It's what humans do. We love to solve problems, and then we get our voice out to the world.
I think too. It's it's learning again how to connect. At least from my point of view, the old storytelling thing. I've listened to podcasts for a long time, but the thought that I could actually do one was something that I didn't think was possible. I thought it was just people that had to use the term, the gift of the gab. But no, you think about it and you have a passion for it, and then you suddenly, all right, you can. In my case, I didn't have a lot of knowledge, but luckily I had John. It brings that out in you. I hated my voice. I really did. I hated my voice the first time I listened to it. I thought, no, this is not going to work. But now I still hate my voice. No, I don't. It's not so bad. No, honestly, it's not so bad. So anybody that's thinking of it and thinking, I can't do that. So after a while, you sort of do, as John says, you get a voice, you understand the way you want to present your podcast. It's very individual. I prefer to go through interviews and talk to people. And that's my style. Another style is to have it totally just one-on-one, and just talk to people. So yeah, it is a matter of finding that preference and working through it, and just enjoying yourself. It's just great fun. It really is.
Yeah, with most of my podcasts, they're audio essays, so I like to have it scripted out because I like writing anyway, and I've always enjoyed the essay form. But when I'm working with you on your podcast as well, it's more ad lib and more free form, and we discuss what's been going on in the interview. And same with this particular format. This is more like when I'm in a classroom, because I have been teaching the course in community colleges around Sydney, and I don't mind talking in public. Talking in public via a screen is a different experience, I must say. But I'm just assuming that there's people out there listening, and so I keep talking. And, it all comes together, I hope. But the matter of getting used to your own voice, by the time you've got used to the tech of recording, it's almost like you're listening to someone else because it's in the earbud.
Right.
I find, and that was how I tricked myself into doing it. But there are different ways, and you just get used to hearing your own voice anyway. We usually have it mediated through the skull, and to have it coming in through the ears is a different feeling. But we all get used to it.
John, it was interesting before when you mentioned about your podcast, Mr. John Moore, which I know you've been running for quite a while, where you experiment with sound. That's something that I've always been interested in, and something that I want to try. What did you mean by that, experiment with sound?
Well, to start with, just to get practice more than anything else, I found a lot of old short stories I'd written and articles and whatnot, just read those in. There was a lot of short stuff on the blog, short 300-400 word posts that I practiced reading those in. And then I've gone to Creative Commons YouTube videos and ripped the sound out of those legally, and then chopped them about and just rearranged them. I've also recorded just walking through town, picking up sounds and fitting them into a story. It doesn't always work. That's the nature of experimental sound. But the ones that are on there, I'm happy with. And if people would like to listen, they can hear what we've done. There was a thing on when the threat of nuclear war between the US and North Korea first started. I went back and Atomic Cafe style dug out some statements from the 50s and 60s from both the Soviets and the US, and then chopped those pieces together and combined it with the firebombing of Dresden. So it was a very uplifting piece, of course.
Absolutely.
But it actually allowed me to say what I wanted to say, because I was angry that we should have to go through all this again.
Yeah.
70-year-old technology. Why are we still threatening each other with nuclear weapons?
Exactly.
And in the end, it's the people pressing the buttons will be fine. It's the rest of us that'll fry. So, yeah. And so we just, whenever I hear a sound I think might be interesting, I've always got a recorder with me, and that ends up becoming second nature, almost an extension of your body once you start podcasting. Even if it's just using your phone, that's a pretty good form of recording nowadays. And you can process it through Auphonic and things. So it works out to be good enough for people to listen to. And if it's not, then I don't use it. So
yeah. And it might work somewhere else. You might come across that and know that you've got it. Do you file them all the way in? I know you told me once that you were down in the city and you spent about half an hour just recording city sounds. I think it was
Yep.
Anzac Day.
It was Anzac Day, yeah, a couple of years back. I was sitting under the train line at Circular Quay because a couple of my mates were marching. I was waiting for them to finish before we went back and had an afternoon discussion. And so I just set the recorder up, hit record. It was this little Zoom. I had it set on 4 channels, so I was recording from the front and the back. And there were people coming off cruise ships, and you could hear the wheels on their suitcases come by in droves, and then there'd be silence, and then there were kids running around and sounds coming in and coming out. I haven't used much of that particular file yet, but I've got it stored just for when I need it.
Okay.
And just going back and listening to it from time to time actually takes me back to that day. It's a funny thing, sound the way. It's quite evocative.
I suppose when you do something like that, you need to mark it straight away in a file, the date and exactly what the sounds contain, so you've got easy access later on when you are telling stories.
Yep, but also at the before I start, when I hit record, I state where I am, what time of the day it is, and what date it is, so that it's actually in the recording as well. So that if I don't get round to putting the date on it immediately, I just have to play the start of the file, and that'll tell me where it was.
That sounds interesting. I know you told me to do the same, and I have got an earlier version of the mic that you're talking into. It's very good, very portable, and it's something that I've got to get some batteries for, and I'll be doing the same. So, thanks for the tip, John.
No, it's okay. It's just a matter of doing it, just in its own time. Well, I think that's probably enough for the moment. It's half an hour of us rambling and allowing people to get a bit of a handle on what it is we do with podcasting and the potential it has. So I'll just finish off by saying, if you'd like to learn more about my course, it's at mrjohnmoore.com. In the right sidebar at the top, there's a free introductory course on the gentle art of editing in GarageBand for those that are interested. Give you a feel of both how I teach and how to edit in GarageBand. And with that, I think we might sign off, Mr. Rich.
Thank you very much, John, and highly recommend the course. Thanks again, mate.
A pleasure. Thanks for coming, Rich.
Bye.